Hello, and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a new weekly podcast shining a spotlight on Australian fiction. My name is Claudine Tinellis. As a writer and avid reader, I love chatting about books. And in this podcast, I'll chat to authors, publishers, and readers, giving you, dear listener, insight into what's hot on the Australian fiction scene. So if you're looking for your next book recommendation or just want to know more about Aussie fiction writers, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back, and enjoy. This week, I'm chatting to Shirley Patton. Shirley's debut novel, The Secrets We Keep, was published earlier this year. It was a fabulous read, and judging by its reception in the months since its release, I was not alone in thinking that. Welcome, Shirley.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you for having me, Claudine.
It's my pleasure. Now, Shirley, I'm always attracted to novels that transport me to a particular time or place. Perhaps it's the wanderlust in me. And your novel does both. It takes readers back to the 1980s and to the remote mining town of Kalgoorlie in Western Australia. Can you tell me why you chose this period and Kalgoorlie for the setting of this novel?
Oh, that's a lovely question. Thank you. Well, I grew up in Kalgoorlie. I had my schooling in Kalgoorlie, and then I worked in Kalgoorlie in a welfare office before I came over to live in Tasmania. And during the 80s, there was a lot of changes that went on and a lot of scandals. It was also a time when policies and practices were changing around community issues. So all of those things were things that I'd experienced. And when I started to write, I was doing a writing course and playing around with ideas and went off on various tangents. But then suddenly found myself becoming very reflective. And I think I put that down to my father passing away and going home to bury him in Kalgoorlie. And I think maybe I became just much more reflective and began to find myself wanting to remember those times and that town, and that then entered into my story. And it wasn't intentional. It just began, I think, out of that reflective process. And I realised that the whole town and its the place had seeped into my skin. And when I started writing, I could see it like a film, like a movie, and I was walking in that film. And I didn't actually set out to write in with the intention of amplifying a sense of place. That was only later that others reading it observed that, and I realised that it had become a character in itself.
Indeed. Shirley, there's a lot to love about this novel. For the benefit of listeners who haven't read it yet, can you tell me a bit more about it?
Yes, the main character is a woman called Amy McCartney, and her father is a politician in the Labor government in the 80s, around which some people may remember was quite a lot of scandals around the entrepreneurs like Alan Bond, and the Burke government, then the Labor government, was new to power and wanting to set up good business relationships that had normally been something that was more a liberal focus. So that was the context of the story where the main character comes from. However, things have happened to her that are traumatic, and trying to, I guess, run away from her background and start a new life, which many of us do in our lives. She has a qualification as a social worker, and she goes to work in a welfare office in the outback town of Kalgoorlie. And her relationships with the people in that community and the women that she works with, and a very quirky character called Agnes King, who reads tea leaves. And so I used the two characters of Agnes and Amy to carry notions of choice, which social work is based upon, and empowerment, and notions of fate and destiny, which the older woman who carries everyone's secrets in the town represents. So I play those two notions of against each other. In fact, the very first sentence of the book encapsulates that, I think, a little with there are moments of destiny and moments of choosing, and we rarely know the difference.
But was there something in particular that inspired you to write Amy and Aggie's story, for example?
Yes, I did know someone who'd had experiences that were, in terms of the dilemma she ends up facing, that they'd experienced. And I'd always wondered, what if? And when I was trying to tie down what it was I wanted to write about, my writing teacher, Robin Friend, who's well known in the Tasmanian community for her many, many years of teaching writers, and for whom she ended up being my mentor. I got a mentorship grant from the state government, and that played a huge part in my crafting. And she said to me, think of a what if question. What is this something that you've always wondered about and wanted the answer to or wanted to explore? And I remember thinking, well, what if you, and I can't give away the plot, but what if you encountered something under circumstances in which you were constrained about what you could say, legally or morally even, but you knew this secret, and what would you do if you came up against that kind of situation? So that allowed me, and I have a social work background, that allowed me then to play with the ideas of ethics and ethical dilemmas. Now, dilemma, of course, is where both of the choices you make are problematic. There are sacrifices in both of those choices, and social workers have to do that every day in their practice. It's not necessarily that you know the right answer. It's more what's the right choice to make, and you have to weigh up all of the consequences. And in this book, we watch Amy and others having to struggle with ethical dilemmas. And, I think you and I and everyone that I know has in times in their life come up against that kind of dilemma. It's not just the big governments and policymakers who try to make these decisions that affect many lives. We too do that, and we too have to live with it and live with the choice we make. And she has to live with the choice she makes in this novel. And I'd like a reader at the end of it, or a book club at the end of it, to go, oh, I don't know if I agree, or would I have done that, or just discuss, is this the decision? Is this the right decision? And I've been to some book clubs, and it's been wonderful to listen to the debates they've had, or what they thought was the right or wrongness of her choices.
Much reference has been made of the sense of place you evoke in this novel, and you talked about this a little bit earlier. So your main character, Amy, arrives in Kalgoorlie during a dust storm, and red dust covers her shoes. And even when there isn't a dust storm, red dust permeates every aspect of the inhabitants' lives. And even the beautiful cover clues us into this aspect of the story. How important was the sense of place to the story you intended to tell?
Oh, I think it's essential, and it was very satisfying to know that people who I've since met who've read it and lived in Kalgoorlie or have been in the outback felt that they could almost taste the dust, and it took them back there again. And I think it was really important in capturing the memories that I had of that place, and being able to put it onto the page was a delightful surprise to me. It truly was. And I again come back to that idea that I mentioned earlier of it being like a film. As I wrote, I was transported into that place. And it just shows you how, 20, 25 years of living in a place and growing up in a place, how much it's imprinted on you, that sense of place. And my next novel is going to be set here in Tasmania, and I've lived here 30 years, and I think it's the childhood thing, because I'm working really hard to do everything I can to get that sense of place here, and walking on land from the 1800s where my story is set. And I have to say it comes much, much easier, I think, from having grown up in a place and unconsciously absorbed that sense of place. So, yeah, I think the sense of place is really important in this particular kind of novel, because in a way I was kind of bearing witness not just to the times but the place, and honouring that. And I think that might be one of the things that people see as a strength in the book. I hope so.
And you launched this book in Kalgoorlie too. So what feedback have you received from locals about it?
The people who have read it in Kalgoorlie that have since come back to me, they're very happy with it. They're very happy with the portrayal of it. They identified with it. They wondered, was that so-and-so or so-and-so? And who was that? Was that based on so-and-so? And some of them recognised there are a few characters in there who are little combinations of people that that I remember.
Now, it's fair to say that you haven't been shy about touching on some significant social and political issues in this book. For example, the environmental impact of mining, Indigenous rights, and mining workers' safety. How important were your experiences as a social worker and then later as an academic to the themes and the issues you reference in the book?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And thank goodness for my mentor, Robin Friend, because I didn't know, again, that this was the book where these ideas wanted to be expressed. I had always, there had always been, those issues had always bothered me, and there were things that always concerned me. And I always thought maybe those ideas might come out somewhere through my academic career. I followed a different path in terms of my concerns and my focus, and I'm known for the work I've done in the area of domestic violence. That's the area I ended up becoming much more focused on and writing to change practice and policies. So these other ideas, that things that had concerned me, didn't end up being my research focus. So I was really surprised when they began to emerge in this fictional story. I felt a sense of wanting to bear witness to these stories. Once I started writing them, it just grew and grew and grew. And fortunately, I had Robin, a friend, identify the need to not write an essay. So I had to really look at the crafting of the story and look at how did the issues be in service to the narrative as opposed to the other way around.
Yes.
And I was very fortunate that Alex Craig, the well-known editor, was my structural editor, and she taught me how to, or supported me to integrate those themes better as well.
And how much research did you have to do, if any?
Oh, look, a lot of it I'd experienced in terms of working in welfare offices and before I even became a social worker, because I wasn't a social worker in Kalgoorlie. I became one, I went to university here in Tasmania. And so there was some research that I had to do around, especially around the uranium. I knew that some of those things were going on, but I didn't have anything concrete. So I began to research that and found that the things that I thought I'd heard going on, that I'd heard about, were confirmed in the research that I did. The Indigenous issues, I linked into the uranium issues as well, and I confirmed those through my research. And the actual writing that I did around the government at the time and the policies and practices, I had a little bit of insight into that because I knew some friends at the time who were involved in the government. So those sorts of things all sort of added up, and so there was both research and my own observations in my life in Kalgoorlie. But the dust issue and underground mining, I knew through my friends that worked in the industry. I knew people who had experienced dust on the lungs.
Now, what is it that you think about the desert or remote locations in particular that hold this allure as in the desire to escape, do you think?
Well, I think most people would think of it as, it's almost iconic, isn't it, going into the desert to find yourself, even in biblical terms. And I think being in a small community, there's more of that sense of connection. There can be. There are lots of constraints about being in small and remote communities, especially for women in all sorts of negative ways that I know of from my domestic violence research. And there are also positives, and that's the connectivity, the capacity for greater connections. And as you saw in Amy's work, you can't leave those connections when you close the door like you might in a city. When you work with a family, you walk out the door and that's the end of your connection. In a country town or in an outback or a remote town, you're you're walking in the same supermarkets together. You might even be at social events together. So there's other things that really create a lot of difference in how you live your life in as a practitioner there. But I think that her coming to that kind of new setting meant that things that could be pushed down in the busyness of a city life and a social life couldn't be pushed down, and they began to come up for her. So all of those emotions that she had been trying to work through talking about it with counsellors, trying to forget about it, feeling that she'd processed and moved on, that began to emerge again when she was confronted with things that reminded her of what it was she was trying to hide from. And of course, it wouldn't be a good story if she didn't then, of course, have to end up facing those and be confronted by them. And that's what I make happen for her, is that inevitably she has to confront the past, and she has to find a way to make a decision that she can live with morally.
What prompted you to begin a new career as a writer?
That's a lovely question to ask any writer, I think, Claudine. Thank you. I loved writing, and as a younger person, I thought I might be focusing. I did start a degree in literature, and then I ended up becoming a social worker after seeing social workers in the Kalgoorlie office that I worked in, and was so impressed by the passion they had to make a difference. And this was in the 80s, after Gough Whitlam had the whole community work movement had started, and there was a lot of activism. So I moved away and into that career, and I'm so glad I did. I had a very satisfying career as a social worker and as an academic and a researcher. And I often used to like to go away and have a couple of days retreat and just write and be reflective and be creative, but it was on the side. And then after I finished my PhD, I had been writing women's stories as part of that, 53 women's stories of their experience of being able to start a new life and escape violence. And I think there was something very satisfying in recording all those, writing all those stories. And I began to have this urge to be more reflective and to want to be more on an inward journey, to be more creative. And so it took about 2 years of thinking about that and planning to decide that I could. And I was very fortunate that I had a partner who could support me in that, because that's not something. And I have other friends who's they've still got to work and try to write, which is so hard.
Yeah.
And of course, people do it, and my hat off to them. But I wanted and was able to, and I feel that that was a real privilege. I realise that's a privileged position to be in, and I'm very grateful for it. I made that decision along with my partner's support to leave my academic career and write full time. And as it turned out, that very year, my father died.
Okay, yeah.
And I am so grateful that I could then have time in which to mourn and reflect on that, and to not be in the position where I would be carrying the kind of responsibility and of a full-time academic career. So as it turned out, it worked very well for me. So I used that time, and then that's when I wrote the story. So you can see that out of that, you can see this grief in the story that I've written, and perhaps that allowed me somewhere to channel that, because somebody did say to me, you got grief right. This was someone who'd lost somebody, and they felt I'd got grief right, and I hadn't really. At the time, I wasn't conscious I was doing that.
Can I ask what you're working on now, Shirley?
Well, yes, I have written. I've written a second novel that's for young adults, that's set in a time of 500 AD in Cornwall, but that's actually going to need to sit by the side for a little while at the moment, because my publishers, I'm hoping, are expecting a second adult novel, which I've started. I've been researching for a couple of years, so we'll see if they're interested in that. I hope so, but I'll be writing it anyway. It's set in the 1860s in Tasmania, and it's a story based on a true story in which there is a bit of a scandal amongst the landed gentry. And I'm going to tell it from a fictional lady's maid. And I want to explore women's friendships, and I want to explore how it still resonates today, of course, how when women speak out, they often end up the casualty as opposed to those who may have been the cause of their distress. So it's kind of got resonance, I think, a little bit of resonance with what's going on in the present.
I wanted to ask if listeners wanted to connect with you or to learn more about you and your books, where can they find you?
Well, I do have an author page from somebody who had very, very little social media platforms. I had a little tiny Facebook, a little tiny family one, and everything was so closed and tight that nobody could find me. And even when I had a more public one, I have a web page now which is I think www.shirley-patton.com. They can contact me through that. And they can find the book on if they go to the HQ HarperCollins website, they can find the book there as well. And I think it's also on all those other well-known places like Booktopia and everywhere else.
Fantastic. Well, Shirley, it's been such a pleasure to talk to you today. Thank you so much for your time, and congratulations on a wonderful debut.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk about my book. That's such a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Now, listeners, don't forget to visit my Facebook page or Instagram feed to find out how to win a copy of Shirley's book or keep up to date with new episodes of this podcast and current promotions. Well, that's a wrap, folks. If you enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes or drop me a line via my Instagram at Claudine Tinellis or on my webpage claudinetинellis.com. Thanks for listening. Until next time, happy reading.